It's my pleasure to introduce Megan Gall. In addition to very patiently responding to many email questions I have about her work, Megan is the in-house social scientist at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law, where her expertise is in statistics and geospatial information. Her PhD is in political science, focused on American state politics and public policy. So with that, we'll get started.
Thank you all for coming out to day 2 of this program. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Megan Gall. I'm the in-house social scientist at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. I put together the quantitative evidence required for Section 2 voting rights cases. Compared to your average legal body, this requires more quantitative analysis than usual. And there are several analytic puzzles that have to come together in order to create a viable claim. As one of my lawyer colleagues likes to say, you have to get a little bit mathy. He's a lawyer, he doesn't love the mathy, but we're gonna get just a little bit mathy. And we're gonna talk about redistricting, the principles that guide redistricting, and then we're going to talk about the quantitative anatomy of a Section 2 voting rights case. I'm going to skip over most of this because Moon covered it yesterday. The one thing I do want to point out is that the Decennial Census is a different animal from the other census products. Census releases a huge amount of data, incredibly useful, but the Decennial Census is the only one that's an actual count. Everything else are estimates. They come with margins of errors that make life difficult, but this is an actual tally, so it does a completely different thing. And we're gonna move straight into redistricting criteria. So, redistricting criteria come from all levels of government. At the federal level, federal requirements are rooted in the US Constitution, and that's where we find one person, one vote principle rooted. At the state level, we have what are called traditional redistricting principles. And then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which tells us how and when we look at race. And then we have local groups. This is more often when we're looking at local jurisdictions, but these groups are really important. So they need to be at the table and their considerations need to be given equal import. So we have these federal and state and local rules that act as constraints to the map maker. The laws and jurisprudence around them are complex, they're intertwined, sometimes they have competing goals, sometimes the groups at the table have competing goals. And because of these dynamics, we have to prioritize the rules that we follow. As one example, and you'll see that there are many, we follow state principles until we hit a federal violation or prohibition, and then we follow the federal principles in order to avoid that violation. Map makers have to have eyes in the back of their heads. We have to keep the traditional redistricting principles in check, while making sure that federal guidelines are kept in check, while making sure that all the other groups at the table have been accounted for. And this is one reason that humans are still needed for the map-making process. It requires prioritization and thoughtfulness. One note on partisanship. The Lawyers Committee is a 501c3. We do not redistrict based on partisanship. We do look at the consequences of partisanship. It's necessary when building the qualitative evidence required in Section 2 cases, but we do not use it in redistricting. As has been mentioned, this is coming up to the Supreme Court, and this is going to change the way that we deal with map making. So eyes on that, but until then, I'm going to leave it aside. So the one person, one vote jurisprudence is rooted in the US Constitution. The Supreme Court ruled that at the federal level, states must attempt to equalize population, and that they need to reapportion regularly to avoid a constitutional violation. At the state level, the court ruled that legislators need to redistrict chambers for roughly equal population and said that it must be done after the decennial censuses, since I don't know how to pluralize that. And that's an important point, because before this came down, some states hadn't redistricted for decades. Oregon redistricted in 1907 and not again until 1960 or 64. So this gave us a regular process to fine-tune. And there's a nuanced difference between federal and state law. State law redistricting gives us some more leniency, but the overall practical implication is that we try to keep districts equal in population. So how do we do that? First, we calculate what's called an ideal district population. This is very simply the total population divided by the number of districts. We get that total population from the decennial census. There's a specific data set called the PL for Public Law 94-171. And it tabulates these data in a particular way that allows us to redistrict. These are publicly available information. Because truly equal districts are not often possible, we talk about deviations from this ideal district size. And this is a relative overall mathematical range that expresses the population equality across districts. So let's take the small county in our example. We have an ideal population size of 714. Let's say our largest district has 728. That's a positive 2% deviation from our ideal. And our smallest district has 700 people, which is a negative 2% deviation from the ideal, which gives us an overall mathematical range of 4%. And this table gives you a good idea about how this plays out in the real world. In a small county, a 4% deviation is 29 people. But when you take this to a large state, it goes to over 140,000. If you look at a large state with a 20% overall deviation, that number grows to over 700,000 people. This is a large deviation. 20% overall deviations in state houses is considered safe, but it does not necessarily protect from court scrutiny, challenge, or revision. And the 20% isn't a hard rule. If there's a compelling state interest in exceeding that, we do. At the Lawyers Committee, I adhere to an internal in-house standard of no more than 4% overall deviation. This is conservative on purpose. We like to bring good cases. That said, I've drawn probably 80 or 90 maps for about 40 or so jurisdictions, and staying within this 4% has very, very rarely been an issue, twice that I can think of. Which is to say, if you see a large deviation, it's not necessarily a problem, but you should ask yourself why this is the case. Here's a summary of deviations in state houses. You can see that most states hit the 10% mark. We have some outliers. Your outliers at the greater than 20% deviation is Hawaii. Their House is at 22% deviation, and their Senate is at 44%. Again, you can break these rules if there's a compelling state interest. And of course, this does not summarize the deviations that happen in your local boards and bodies. And I really encourage you to go home and look at your maps for your local bodies that govern you and check out their deviations, check out their district lines. This should be publicly available information, and it's a way that you can get involved in this process and in the community. There are alternatives to total population. In the Evenwell case, total population was challenged in favor of eligible population. The court issued a squishy ruling here. They said that states may use total population. They did not rule on whether states could use citizen voting age population, but they said that we can use total population. And of course, there are state exceptions, like Washington excludes non-resident military from their redistricting base. So those are the origins and practical implications of the one person, one vote. We try to keep the districts equal. Let's talk about the state-adopted traditional redistricting principles. These are rules and constraints that additionally constrain the map maker. A huge thanks to the National Conference of State Legislatures, who made the data that feeds the maps you're gonna see. They keep these data online and fresh, and that is very useful to folks like us. So states embed these criteria in their state constitutions, in statutory codes. They come from all over. And we're, for the political scientists, getting into some laboratories of democracy territory here, because states can choose any amalgam of these principles that they want. The top map shows the principles adopted by state legislative branches. The bottom map shows the principles adopted by congressional branches. And here we have compactness. As you can see, this is an often adopted principle, but by no means universal. Notice that in the congressional side, Illinois does not require compactness. We're gonna come back to that, remember that. And when we talk about compactness in this context, most agree that we're generally talking about geographic compactness. This is different than the compactness we're gonna talk about in section 2 that talks about the compactness of the minority population. There are many tests for this. They all yield different results. And very few jurisdictions have defined how to detect it. Most courts find compactness desirable, but there are no official delineations, no statistical thresholds, and the Supreme Court has not ruled on a definitive test. These measures are really good for comparing plans, which can often be quite useful. Contiguity is one of the less squishy principles. It basically means that you can't bust up a district into geographically separate pieces. There are exceptions to this, like islands, that obviously demand non-contiguity. But in general, this is easy to accommodate and non-controversial. And next we have preservation of political subdivisions. And this means that we try to preserve cities and counties and wards within districts. This is not always clear-cut. Sometimes city boundaries overlap with county boundaries, and it makes that not as clean. So what do you do when this happens? You keep subdivisions together until you can't, and then you don't, which is kind of the moral of my story here. Sometimes you have to split subdivisions. In large states, you might have a county that exceeds the ideal district population, so you must bust up some of these sub-jurisdictions. And there's no jurisprudence around how to do this, and it leads to questions like, well, if I need to split a jurisdiction, is it better to split many jurisdictions a few times, or a few jurisdictions many times? And this is in the eye of the map maker. We have to make a solid decision here. Preservation of communities of interest is definitely as squishy as it sounds. We try to keep groups with similar geography, trade, social interactions together. This is extremely broad, except that the Supreme Court has said that a community of interest is not race and it's not a voting bloc. So when you think communities of interest, think non-racial communities of interest. This principle is relatively low on the list of priorities. It's often thought of as more aspirational than mandatory. And often you have to get on the ground and understand the cultural landscape in order to inform this principle in the first place. Preservation of core districts is exactly what it sounds like. When we have prior districts, we try to modify them to keep the cores intact. You see that far fewer states are concerned with this principle. And we have a new category from New Mexico, which says, if you want to, you can consider it. That's fine by us. And lastly, we have protection of incumbents. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Sometimes we draw lines that are designed to protect incumbents. This is bound to make some of you feel one kind of way, some of you to feel another kind of way. And as you can see, the states agree. Some specifically prohibit it, and some specifically demand it. And then we have these sub-county rules. These are the rules that get adopted by city councils, advisory boards, county commissions. They must be pursuant to state and federal law, and they don't come with the same force of law behind them. But in these sub-jurisdictions, often the local players are critical to the entire story. And so they need to be brought to the table and given equal weight when possible. So if you think that states are laboratories for democracy, I believe it was Kristen yesterday who gave the count of local bodies at about 8,000 in the US. They're all noodling around with these principles, and they can pick whatever ones they want. And so again, I encourage you to go back to your homes and look up these things and educate yourself on what's happening at the local level. So these are the overall rules for state and federal redistricting, but we still have to consider compliance with the Voting Rights Act. So when do we consider race and ethnicity in map making? How do we consider it, and why do we consider it at all? A little bit of history, because it helps with context, and I'm going to go way back. The first African people landed in Jamestown on a Dutch ship in 1619. There were about 20 people. From there, the system of chattel slavery of Africans grew and thrived for over 200 years. This was an incredibly brutal time in our history. It was not that long ago. And slavery ended with the Civil War. After that, we got the 14th and 15th Amendments. After the passage of the 15th Amendment, we saw 500,000 black men get registered in the South. And we saw black candidates make inroads in the South and get elected. This was during the time of Reconstruction, which is when the federal government came into the South to help rebuild. But when the government retracted and left the South, what we saw were state parties ushering in state-level rules to suppress the black vote. This was the era of poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and this lasted for nearly 100 years until we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was designed to deal with discrimination like this. We know that the 1965 version of the Voting Rights Act gets at the notion of intent or intentional discrimination, and the amendment of 1982 gets at results, which is more unintentional discrimination. So what do intent and results look like? Let me give you an illustrative story. With the outright denial of vote prohibition by the federal government, state-level suppression tactics became necessary. And white political leadership at local levels in Mississippi led what was called a massive resistance to these changes. The Mississippi legislature held a regular and special session to produce legislation, and they produced 13 pieces of legislation, none that directly denied the right to vote, but all designed to suppress. The local newspapers told the stories that the politicians couldn't, and they ran an article that urged the custodians of Mississippi's white supremacy machinery to take a serious and studied look at the racial composition of the state's congressional districts in view of the NAACP's vigorous drive for Negro voting rights. The same newspaper noted that although there's no sizable bloc in Mississippi, the legislature can be expected to redistrict to split there, and so they did. What you see here is the geopolitical regions of Mississippi. You see the Delta region here. The Delta region has nutrient-rich lands fed by the Mississippi. This was indeed the location of the richest and largest plantations, which at the time translated to a handful of extremely wealthy white plantation owners and a lot of black farmhands living in extreme poverty. The map on the left shows the districts as they were shaped from 1882 to 1962, so for about 80 years. The shaded counties are majority African American, and District 3, the Delta region, you can see it runs sort of north-south, and for all three of those redistricting, this district was kept intact. The map on the right shows the districts after the 1960 reapportionment. Mississippi lost a seat. They still kept the Delta region as an intact district. But the growing enfranchisement meant that it was no longer safe for white political incumbents. Black voters with the enfranchisement had the numbers to elect a candidate of choice. It's reasonable to assume they might elect a candidate that did not support white supremacy. So this was a threat to the white politicians. And not just that, but a black candidate would be a direct threat to the regime. So how did they fix this perceived problem? Mississippi Congress came up with the plan on the left. As you can see, it splits the districts east-west instead of north-south. They broke the district up into 4 districts, none with an African American majority. As is procedure, they kicked it to the Senate, and the Senate said, "This is way too obvious." And they said, "We need to build a map that we can all live with and that can withstand court scrutiny." And so the Senate came up with the plan on the right. It breaks the Delta region up into 3 districts, one with a 55.3% majority. This led the houses into political deadlock. That went for a while until they settled on this map, which breaks the districts into 3, still east-west, and it left one district with a slight African American majority at 51-point-something%. But the majority, it was still majority white in terms of voting age population and registered voters. And this plan was intact till 1982, 1982, preventing black candidates from electing their candidates of choice. And this is a great example of cracking, which is a vote dilution method you still see today, and we've been talking a lot about. So now we know what discriminatory results and intent look like. We know their violations So how do we establish this for the court? The Supreme Court case Thornburg v. Gingles in 1986 involved North Carolina General Assembly plans, and it was the first case that applied the 1982 amendment with results. The court found that the ability of a cohesive group of black voters to participate equally and elect their candidate of choice was impaired, and they set up a legal framework for establishing that. This framework is the touchstone of a Section 2 case. At the time, people wondered if it was necessary, but it has proven workable in practice. I'm not going to read the Gingles preconditions to you in Legalese, but the first precondition gets to redistricting. Jingles 2 and 3 get to the degree of racially polarized voting. And that's, by definition, the extent to which different racial groups vote as distinct blocks for distinct candidates of choice. And we want to measure those patterns. So Jingles 1, as I said, this is a redistricting question. We want to know if the racial or language minority is sufficiently numerous and compact enough to form a majority-minority single-member district. And here we're no longer talking about total population. Here we want to look at voting age population, and that's because if we redistrict for total population, we still might deprive minorities of the ability to elect the candidate of choice. This is exactly what the Mississippi legislature counted on. So there's a lot of verbiage here. So what is sufficiently numerous? This is a really simple math problem. Let's say you have a county with 25% minority population, and you have a county commission with 4 districts. You might expect that one of those districts, 25%, either is a majority-minority district or has a minority preferred candidate seated. Compact. Here, folks generally agree that we're talking about the compactness of the minority population. We want to know if the minority population is clustered enough or compact enough to constitute a district. The nation's ongoing residential segregation plays a role here. If neighborhoods and areas were residentially integrated, we couldn't draw a map. But it wouldn't matter anyway, because in these areas we find very little evidence of racially polarized voting. We see white voters cross over to vote for minority preferred candidates. But residential segregation is a staple of American life, and it's still at play today. And finally, what is a minority? Well, a minority group can be one group, or it can be a coalition of groups. If we build a case on a coalition of minority voters, all of those groups must behave as one block, one politically cohesive block. Right now, the Lawyers Committee is litigating a case in Gwinnett County, Georgia. It's one of the first tripartite coalition claims. The tripartite coalition constitutes about 43% of the population. They vote as a politically cohesive group. The Board of Education has one majority-minority district, and the Board of Commissioners has none. And in both cases, we argue for 2 majority-minority seats based on that coalition claim. There is a lot of data required for this. Data for Jingles 1, far easier than data for Jingles 2 and 3. So for Jingles 1, what we need are census block shapefile with the blocks and demographic data from that PL data set from the census that I mentioned. For the most part, areas are redistricted based on blocks, but again, there are always exceptions. Louisiana redistricts based on precincts, and they have rules about how you can break precincts. We also like to have a shapefile. Shapefile for the non-GIS people is the data that goes into a GIS to let us build maps. So we like to have a shapefile of the current districts. This lets us do two things. It lets us assess the populations in the current districts. If there's already a majority-minority district, we might not have an investigation. If we do move to draw a map, we can use those districts to preserve the prior district cores if that's something that we're interested in. I forgot something on this side. A majority-minority district is 50% minority voting age population plus one person. This is clearly the slowest majority that you can have. Generally, it's not enough to allow minorities to elect a candidate of choice, so we like to give a better cushion than that. So, I told you the data that we must have for Gingles 1. There are also data that we like to have that help us keep the traditional redistricting principles in check. Those are things like shapefiles with county or city boundaries. Those are things like incumbent home addresses, so that if we need to protect those incumbents, we can draw our districts appropriately. And so, if all of these benchmarks, equal population, traditional redistricting principles, and Gingles 1 all get satisfied in one map, you might have a claim. But you still have to satisfy Gingles 2 and 3. Again, Gingles 2 and 3 gets at racially polarized voting, which is when distinct racial groups express distinct electoral preferences. And Gingles 2 and 3 ask these three basic questions. Is voting racially polarized? If so, who are the minority candidates of choice? And do those candidates of choice usually get defeated? These questions all speak to racial bloc voting. They all get assessed with the same set of measures, and they all must be answered in the affirmative. If any of these pieces drop out of our puzzle, the investigation is over. So, we have several ways to assess racially polarized voting. Not all of the methods are listed here, but the data that we need, the data that feeds it, are all kind of the same. And so part of the issue here is that in the US, we keep a secret ballot. I don't get to know how you voted, but I want to know how you voted. More specifically, I want to know how you voted by group. And so we take three critical pieces of data and we bring them together to estimate how we voted. As happens in mathematics, methods start out rather primitive and they advance, and sometimes these speak to what we're able to do in court, and that'll come up in a moment. So, data requirements for EI. As I said, all the different methods feed off of these same data. So we need data at the precinct level. We need the candidate vote totals by precinct. This goes directly into the statistic. We need to know the demographics of the candidate, what their party ID is, what their racial and ethnic background are, and that's because it helps us build the qualitative story. We need to know who these folks are. And then finally, we need the electorate by race and ethnicity. Here we have a hierarchy of data. Turnout at the precinct level by race and ethnicity is the best. If we can't have that, we look for registration. And if we don't have that, we move to voting age population, which we get from the Census Bureau. For the demographic data in areas without turnout and registration, which is most areas, we almost always need a precinct shapefile in order to marry the GIS data to the shapefile. And this presents an entire data acquisition problem because areas can move their precincts before any election. We need the precinct shapefile for every election that we're looking at. It's not just one. And if we run the analysis based on the most recent precincts and not on the past ones that were in place at the time, we're going to get erroneous results. Shapefiles are difficult to get. Sometimes they're posted online, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're not available at all and they're only available by PDF. Sometimes they cost a lot of money, sometimes they're free. Sometimes jurisdictions are forthcoming, sometimes they are resistant. Often, jurisdictions don't keep the precinct shapefiles from past elections. They just simply don't exist. We put in a request once for a shapefile and we received a photograph of a map on the wall that was colored in with highlighters. And we didn't question that they gave us their best faith effort, but it's not enough, and we couldn't do anything with that. It's a problem. So for the electoral data, which are the candidate votes, these are sometimes online, they're sometimes not. Sometimes these data are held by the state, sometimes by the county, sometimes by the city. Sometimes you need separate pieces of data, the state holds some and the county holds others, or vice versa. Sometimes the data are free. We've also been asked to fork over 10K, which we didn't do. Sometimes the data are cataloged in really amazing state databases with user manuals that you bang your head against for a week because it turns out the manual is wrong. This happens. You just have to deal with the data. And so when I say 3 whole pieces of data, that makes this sound easy. It's really not. You are never going to go to a place and find this data set put together for you. This is one of the largest hurdles we have in-house. It's one of the biggest time sucks. Our litigation team spends an enormous amount of time collecting data. I spend an enormous amount of time cleaning and shaping it. Everybody spends an enormous amount of time collecting these data. So let's move into some of the methods. Homogeneous precincts is the most primitive of our methods. For purposes of analysis, we isolate precincts with 90% minority, and we isolate precincts with 90% majority. We average the candidate support, and we ascribe that level of support to the entire jurisdiction. So, in the example, we have 2 homogeneous black precincts. They gave 5% support average to candidate A, and on average 90% support to candidate B. In our 5 homogeneous white districts, on average, they supported candidate A at 80% and candidate B at 15%. And we would say that this is racially polarized because these groups are expressing distinct preferences. This makes a lot of assumptions, like ascribing the support in a homogeneous precinct to the entire jurisdiction. There's no real-world reason that we should assume that is true. It also relies on the existence of homogeneous precincts and the existence of the residential segregation that makes that feasible. once you sort of get into these methods, is actually a really great way to eyeball the data. I can look at the raw data and the patterns in it and generally predict what the more sophisticated statistics are going to tell us. Next, we have ecological regression. This is a bivariate regression that summarizes the relationship between two of the pieces of data I already talked about, the racial and ethnic composition of the precinct, so that's demographics by precinct, and the votes for each candidate by precinct. This improved methodologically by using all of our precincts, but it gave us estimates that were outside the bounds of logic. We know a candidate can't get less than 0% of support, and we know a candidate can't get more than 100% support. And the fact that ER gave us estimates outside of those bounds made life uncomfortable for people like me. And next we have EI, and this was developed by Gary King in 1997, and it is still the analytic focus. And this is the process of inferring individual level data from aggregate level data, right? Because I get to know how we voted at a precinct level. This method incorporates the method of bounds, which restricts our estimates to real world estimates. And then it combines that into a maximum likelihood estimator that gives us estimates of our group voting behavior. EI is great for modeling contests with two racial groups, and we can calculate confidence intervals that lets us get at statistical significance, which is something we didn't have in the older methods. And so for every investigation, I run a bunch of EI statistics. We run one statistic for every candidate. In most official reports, you will only see estimates reported for the minority candidate. But in-house, we run it for every candidate. It gives us context. It gives us more context about the statistic itself, about the contest in question, and about the body of contests we're looking at. Generally, we like to build a 10-year election history. And so we want to look at the patterns through that entire 10 years. And I put the same table at the bottom here because in general, what you're going to get to in the end is the same table. You just got to it by a different method. And the most mature method we have right now is called EI R by C, which stands for rows by columns. This is a hierarchical Bayesian method, and it builds on EI by allowing us to model more than two groups. This is critically important for cases like our Gwinnett County case. And while this has not been widely used yet, given the demographic trends, I think it's going to be used more and more. And you're going to see coalition claims come up because we have a way to estimate and demonstrate this phenomena. So our puzzle just got bigger, right? If you can tackle the redistricting criteria in one map, and you can answer the Gingles preconditions all in the affirmative, then you might likely have a claim. And I say might likely have a claim because even with those things locked down, there are things that can kill an investigation. These analyses are described by the court as the evidentiary linchpin to voting rights cases. We start with the quantitative analyses because if this falls through, we don't have an investigation. But there's no particular way of going about this. It's more of a data scrum than a linear process. Sometimes I redistrict, sometimes we do EI first. No investigation looks the same. No data collection for an investigation looks the same. So, how do we balance all of this? You all know this earmuffs district. It gets absolutely battered in the press. being held up as the epitome of the redistricting problem. But context is everything. Here's your earmuffs district. This is in the Chicago area. It is Illinois' 4th congressional district, and it is majority-minority Latino. But it is surrounded by majority-minority African-American districts. These districts exist because the African-American population in Chicago is large and because there was extreme racially polarized voting. But over the decade, Latino epicenters started growing, and it turns out we could draw a district. And in fact, we could draw a compact district that linked these two. But if we did that, we would have to mess with one of the pre-existing African-American districts. Also, all the other districts in Illinois are majority white. So this was the essence of the problem. We could draw a Latino majority district with compactness. That exercise is feasible. But then we'd have to redraw the majority black districts. And if we wanted 3 majority black districts and 1 majority Latino district, some district was going to have a funky shape. This was litigated in King v. Illinois State Board of Elections. There was no doubt that the traditional redistricting principle of compactness was subsumed. There was no doubt. But remember, Illinois does not require us to think about compactness when we're redistricting congressional districts. In fact, they don't require us to think about any of those. But this Latino majority-minority district did and does serve a compelling state interest, which is to produce a district where this population can elect a candidate of choice. And this is a good example of the thoughtfulness and prioritization that's required in making maps that can withstand court scrutiny like the earmuffs district did. Lastly, I am unabashed in my adoration of the Census Bureau. We have the 2020 census coming up. This is constitutionally mandated, and the results are critical to redistricting and reapportionment. They're moving to a survey system, so participate. Keep your eyes out. When you see that survey come across, get on it ASAP. You save them money, and money right now is an issue for the Census Bureau. If you see people around you who might benefit from a helping hand in getting their survey filled out, help that person. Get them counted. We want everybody counted. At the bottom here, that's the end of my talk. At the bottom here, folks have asked me for the Intro to GIS materials. This is a link where you can download all of those materials. The exercise is all there. You can do everything with that download. Thank you, and please help me keep this conversation going.
Thank you, Dr. Gall. These GIS resources will also be posted on the MGGG webpage. So this question is a synthesis of something that many people in our audience were curious about, and it's a two-part question. First, what best practices should counties or states follow regarding how they store their data and make it available? And second, is it realistic to push for legislation or regulation to put these into effect?
Yes, and yes, that is my personal opinion. I think jurisdictions should save all of their past data. I think that should be open to the public. And given the way our technology lets us store data, this shouldn't really be a problem. I believe it should be posted on their websites so that we don't have to bother asking, we can just go get it. We are moving towards a more open data environment, but yes, I believe that there can be best practices. I believe that a lot of jurisdictions don't follow them, and anything that could marshal us in that direction would be great by me.
How do you distinguish between, for example, the way African Americans vote versus the way people with African American neighbors vote?
Ask me that again.
How do you distinguish between, for example, the way African Americans vote versus the way people with African American neighbors vote? Because of what you were saying about the secret ballot and using statistics to...
So, if I understand the question, that's why we use precinct level data, so that we can understand at a smaller level how everybody in the jurisdiction is behaving. You can run EI on any geography, but the results are going to be most accurate at the precinct level. EI does give estimates. So we rely on one main estimate as how we understand a group to vote. But the statistic actually makes an estimate for each precinct. And the computer will give those to you if you ask for it. And I've often mapped those estimates to get an understanding of group preferences across the board.
What motivates an investigation to begin? Does an organization or state request it?
I don't know if we've had requests from states. That's a better question for the lawyers. But we get cases by looking for them, looking at demographic data, trying to figure out where we might see infractions. Sometimes we run EI and look to see if there's racially polarized voting. But the main place that we get our cases are from people saying, hey, I think you should look at this place. Often those people are wrong, that we don't find anything that's legally viable. That doesn't mean that what they're seeing on the ground isn't real. It just means that we can't move that into a viable legal claim. But we get a lot of tips from the people in the community, which is a way that everybody can help.
How does early voting and provisional balloting complicate EI when some states do not assign those votes cast to precincts but to the county?
It complicates EI enormously. Enormously. Sometimes jurisdictions will reallocate those voters back to their home precincts. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's cataloged one way in the vote data, but cataloged another way in the demographic data, so you cannot get them to align. And I had something else, but I am blanking on what it was. Can you ask me the question again?
Yes. How does early voting and provisional balloting complicate EI when some states assign those votes to the county instead of to the precinct?
So when the jurisdiction makes a mess of those data, like I just said, often what I'll do is run early voting or absentee voting as its own precinct in the EI analysis. We treat it as a precinct. And that has generally worked well. The one thing I will say about the data is no matter how bad they are, you need to understand that the other side has the exact same data. So you're all working on the same playing field, which is helpful.
Yesterday, we heard that judges don't necessarily know Algebra 1. Is EI too complicated for court? Please say more about this.
So EI has been used in court for some time. Yes, it is complicated to explain to judges, and the more it can be distilled, the better. That is going to be an upcoming challenge when we move to the R by C Bayesian methods, right? Because that's just sort of a whole extra thing to attempt to explain. I've read some expert reports that are very thick and make these essentials difficult to get to. And I've read expert reports that make it very easy and clear to understand.
Can you give an example of a community of interest that has been kept together by consideration in map making?
I am going to skip that question. I looked for several instances where communities of interest were held together. And generally what I found was that the court ruled that they were not. There must be instances where they were, and I apologize that I can't give you that. And I actually asked 3 of my lawyer colleagues who also sort of said, I don't really know. Which is why I say it's a really sort of a squishy principle that's difficult to wrangle.
Does the Lawyers Committee have plans to create model district maps following the 2020 census?
Not currently, but we are still building our plans and amassing what we're going to do. And I will say that if you're interested in this, now is the time to do that planning. If you wait until after the census to start gathering your data, you are already behind the curve. So we are in those planning stages, and hopefully we'll do a lot with the 2020 census.
Can you speak to how economic class has affected redistricting?
We don't look at economics specifically, which is not really true. We don't look at it in terms of these analyses. We look at economics often in terms of building more of the qualitative picture around Section 2 cases. If we see a disparate impact and we know that there is a divergent economics between the 2 groups, we will quantify that with census data and we will build that into our narrative. But it doesn't come into play with this work.
For what states are good data available? If a state or locality could do one thing to make your job easier, what would it be?
It would be to make these data far easier to get. So the states that are the best are the states that were previously under Section 5, because they collected these data to make sure that they weren't going to be in federal violation. And so you see the remnants of some of these states in the South still collect race by turnout. Outside of the South, you're probably not going to find that. You might find registration by turnout in some areas, but in general, what they can do to make my life easier and to make the lawyers that I work with make their lives easier is to make these data easier to find and easier to compile.
Is there any effort that you know of to create a repository for updated precinct shapefiles so organizations don't have to duplicate efforts and research? Are there barriers to creating such a thing?
So the barriers to creating it are what I've already talked about, these issues with finding data writ large, especially for local areas. So if you wanted to build a national database with local jurisdictions, you have to get in touch with every single one of them, get their precinct shapefile, hope it doesn't change. And so that is a big hurdle. Yes, I do believe there are efforts to bring that about. I don't know that I know enough to speak about them, but there are efforts, and I believe we're going to hear about some of them. And we're working on them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gall.